and written.
Mhm.
Stephen Mills has advised and written for an array of public interest organizations in the field of human rights, civil liberties, and the environment. Since 1983, he has worked with the Natural Resource Defense Council, building campaigns that have mobilized millions of people in support of environmental protection. Stephen is honored to serve as an ambassador for Child USA, the leading nonprofit think tank for the civil rights of children. He lives in California with his wife, Susan. If you have any questions, we can put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them at the end of the discussion. So your book was a great service to people who have suffered. This is a vital and necessary book. It takes a lot to come out and tell this story. Can you tell us how you decided to write the book?
Sure. It was actually a very long process. I can't say there was an actual decision. I was compelled to do it. And that process began back in 1987. And if you read the book, there is a scene with an FBI agent in the fall of 1987, after the FBI failed to investigate and prosecute the perpetrator. And this FBI agent, who was pretty upset at the Bureau, suggested to me that, she said, you're a writer, you should write about this. You really need to raise public awareness. And that planted a seed. And over the next few years in the late 80s, I took several stabs at it and found myself unable. And over the ensuing decades, I would try, I'm a writer by profession. I've never in my life had writer's block, except around this topic, and hardly a surprise, right? Because these events of deeply traumatic events, when one is sexually abused, are so difficult to approach, much less process to a point where you can write about them, that it can often, it takes as long as it takes. And for me, it took until 2018 when a couple of things happened. One was, just in 2017, the Larry Nassar case really exploded into view, following Rachel Denhollander stepping forward and then joined by more than 150 other women who had been abused by him when they were girls. This is the gymnast case, of course. And then in the spring of 2018, a piece that some of you may have read by Junot Diaz appeared in the New Yorker called The Legacy of Childhood Trauma. And it was really just a beautiful, honest, heartrending account of his rape as a little boy. And that same day, a couple of writer friends called me and said, you really better get this done. We need more stories from men. So that's when I really undertook it in earnest. And once I started, it actually, finally, after all those decades, it went very quickly. 18 months later, I was done with the first draft. Interestingly, instead of writer's block, I had kind of the opposite problem. I just couldn't turn it off, once I turned it on. And the first draft was twice as long as the book that you now see.
I usually ask this at the end, but I'm going to ask it now. How did you get a publisher, and how did you get the book published? And did the first publisher buy it?
So I've written other books, although it had been many years, and I have a terrific literary agent, Gail Ross, and Gail was a huge supporter of the book. I had sent it to her after the first 2 of 3 parts were complete, and she was very enthusiastic about it and really helped me get through it. And then she sent it to about 18 editors, and it was a very interesting process. The feedback, all of them read it on Gail's Say So, and I'd say 17 out of the 18 thought it was spectacular, but most of them found it a little too hot to handle. You know, they were like, I'm not sure how to market this. Topic is too hard. You know, survivor books are too difficult for us. But there was one editor from Metropolitan Books, which is part of Holt, an editor called Reva Hockerman, who I've always respected because she does very tough books, was just completely in love with the book. And we had a deal within, I think, 3 days. And she was really a godsend for me because she's a spectacular editor and really helped make it a better book. And she's also, I should say, born in Israel, has published a lot of Jewish books, just has a keen sense of issues in the Jewish world. And that was a big help.
I couldn't put the book down. As tough as the topic was, I just kept reading and reading and reading. So I have a question, though. I don't know. In 1978, you were 23 years old, and you went to work for Dan Farinella.
Right.
How did you work for a man who sexually abused you?
Yeah, great.
And I understand you had to do this to survive. You did it to survive in camp, but
yeah. It's a super important question, and it's one I'm really glad you asked it, because I think it's so important for all of us to learn what the nature of how trauma operates. And of course, we see this not just with kids abused, but with women in cases of domestic violence. Why do victims go back to their abusers? And there's a term for this, which is trauma bonding. I mean, more common, of course, is the term Stockholm syndrome. I didn't understand that until after 1978. But once I understood it, I was very clear that I had been taken hostage by this man, a social worker, who had, under false pretenses, gotten my mother's permission to take me 100 miles from home in the middle of the woods and sexually assaulted me. That was the first of 2 years of repeated sexual abuse. And when something like that happens to you as a child, even as an adult, but I'm going to speak to my experience as a child, I was so out of my body, so dissociated from the experience. I had no language for what had happened. And I was utterly emotionally dependent on this adult who had all the power in the world over me and all the authority. He was the director of camp. You did not disobey the director of camp. After the first episode, and you see this in the book, and this is quite typical of all the survivors I know, there is a desperate need to go back to normalcy, to pretend everything's okay. I mean, after that weekend of being sexually assaulted, I had to go back to school. I was in 7th grade. I faked my way through the rest of my childhood and teenage years. I didn't consciously know that. But of course, if you were to open yourself emotionally to what you'd experienced, you'd be completely overwhelmed. So our minds and bodies protect ourselves by cutting off the experience, right? The body is holding this terrible shock because I was in a state of shock when I was assaulted. But the body doesn't share that with the conscious mind. The conscious mind is oblivious. It's just going about its business the best it can, while the body is holding on to this state of trauma as long as it takes until you'll look at it. And for some people, that can be years or decades, and for some, it's never. And one suffers terribly in the meantime. But going back to your question, 8 years later, well, 10 years after the first sexual abuse, I went to work for him in my early 20s because in my conscious mind, as hard as this is to understand, unless you've been abused or assaulted in any way as a child or adult, I still thought he was my friend. I thought he was my mentor. He wrote me a college recommendation, right? This is the sense of normalcy that I had to maintain to prevent myself from getting in touch with the state of shock that I was still in the grip of. Most interesting is in that summer when I was 23, was when I discovered that he was still sexually abusing boys. And that revelation, as you can read in the book, is really what set in motion everything else that ultimately led toward my trying to bring him to justice before he harmed other children. So, in a strange way, I'm really, really happy that I went to work for him as an adult, because that was my summer of reckoning. That's where I saw, finally, when I saw that he was abusing other boys, I could no longer live in denial of what he had done to me. I mean, the truth was staring me in the face, and so I had to deal with it. And for several years, I didn't deal very well. I mean, that's the story of part 2 of the book, is what happens when you have to face your own trauma without support, without explanation, without many of the wonderful things we have these days, like children's advocacy centers and, therapy. And this was years and years, decades before anyone was talking about really sexual abuse of children in general, but specifically the sexual abuse of boys. That didn't happen until 25 years later with the Spotlight series in the Boston Globe. So I was really feeling my way around in the dark when this started to unravel in 1978.
You said in the book that there was a point in the book where you saw him go into a bunk with other boys. Did you think did you think he was only doing this to you, or did you ever
Yes,
think that he
I
was
did.
doing this to other people?
Yeah, I thought it was only me. And I can tell you, having spoken to many, many, many of his other victims, with one exception, every single one of those men, when I contacted them, said, I was sure I was the only one. And of course, that's how the abuser wants it. It's all about isolating the victim, dominating your life, physically, emotionally, psychologically. So once the abuse begins, my world shrank and got smaller and smaller and smaller. The last thing I was paying attention to was what was going on around me. I had no clue. And that is pretty much the experience of virtually all the other victims, and not just with this perpetrator, but that's quite common, even in, including cases with, Catholic priests who have had hundreds and hundreds of victims. There's what I'd call, in quotes, the most successful predators are quite adept at isolating victims and keeping them entirely in the dark, that this could be happening to someone else.
You said in the book, when in part 2, you talked about your depression and the drugs. You want to talk about that a little, of what happened to you?
Yeah, well, what, the wheels came off, in my 20s. I really, again, this is something I understand with hindsight, because I see it in so many men who are sexually abused as children. There's a tendency among men, even more than girls and women, to numb the pain much longer. That is to try to keep the sense of trauma as far away as possible. And so the pattern with guys, and I was typical, is to turn to alcohol, drugs, and suicide attempts before reaching out to help. If you're lucky enough not to kill yourself, that's commonly a point at which, if you survive a suicide attempt, you might reach out for help. And for most guys, this is in our 30s, really average age, kind of mid-late 30s. I hear this over and over again, and it's been documented now in a lot of psychological studies. Women tend to reach out earlier, being more social. And also there's a different layer of shame that men carry, which also explains this sort of numbing and self-destructive impulse. And that is just, as a boy, being sexually abused carries a stigma that's just different from what girls experience. It's horrific what girls go through. But boys, of course, we understand from the grade school playground that you're not allowed to be weak. You're held in contempt if you're weak as a boy or as a man, right? We're all about, in this culture, all about toughness, all about power. So to be assaulted and helpless and victimized is just incredibly shameful for a boy. And then there's the sexual confusion. Whether you're straight or gay or non-binary, there is tons of sexual confusion wrapped up in this that takes a long, long time to sort out. So those are the triggers that tend to send guys, and certainly sent me off the rails in the 20s. And that was a good 8-year period of really a black hole that I was fortunate to survive, really by dumb luck. I could tell the story in the book about how I found my way to a therapist in my late 20s, earlier than most, in New York, and then to another therapist, and then to meet the woman who would become my wife eventually, who really helped me take a hard look at what had happened, and gave me the support to do that. That's crucially important.
I know it was at times,
By
like
the
with,
way, I just want to add this in because I think it's very interesting, and telling. Several of the victims of this same perpetrator, and this is not at all unusual, 50 years later, have not shared this with their wives. So what does that tell you about the kind of shame that they're living with?
it's terrible. So you also said in the book that some of the employees at the camp, they actually saw you go in and out of his cabin with him. Why
Yes.
didn't they tell anyone? I mean, you sort of mentioned in the book, but why don't they tell anyone? Were you afraid that nobody would believe you? What? I know the times are different now, so it's more
Yeah.
talked about, but
Yeah, well, the times are and aren't different. They certainly are, and that protocols are better. We can talk about that later. It's sort of a separate discussion. We still have a long way to go in camps and youth serving organizations. But at the time, it's really sort of the classic situation where you have a charismatic, powerful head of an institution who has everyone around him intimidated. And that includes his colleagues, his employees, other social workers, and the two guys I'm talking about in the book who knew, and they were not the only ones. I mean, they were senior staff at this camp, but there were at least 6 others, counselors in their 20s, who knew. Of all of those, only one confronted him, and no one went to the Jewish Council of Chicago, which ran the camp. And, number one, they feared him. There was a lot of fear of him. I mean, physical fear. He intimidated people. They feared for their jobs. This is very typical in any institution, whether it's the Boy Scouts or the church or Jewish camps. People fear for their jobs. They fear to speak out and be ostracized for questioning the most powerful person in their world. That's a very scary thing to do, So I certainly don't hold it against those two. I changed their names at their request, and it's interesting that you bring it up. One of them has died. The other one is very much alive, and I showed him the manuscript. He asked me to change his name. I asked him why, and he said, well, I don't want my kids or this other guy's kids to think like we could have done more. I don't want to be culpable. And I said, well, really, you could have done more, but I'm not here to give you a hard time. I'll change your name. Interestingly, 2 weeks ago, I heard from the son and daughter of one of those guys. They had heard about the book, they read it, and one of them, I'm calling her a girl, but she's in her 30s, was herself the victim of sexual assault. And she found the book so true to her own experience and so important for her, right, in terms of facing her experience. And such an important story about her father, about what he failed to do. And again, not not critical of him, but just wanting to face the truth, in their family together, and to learn from it and to do better, right, going forward in her life and her brother's life. And, I found that very, very moving, and really restored a bit of my faith in people, that while his generation was incapable, I have the feeling that her and her brother, uh, are much more attuned to this. And in general, I think millennials are much more in tune to these issues and more inclined to come to the defense of kids.
I certainly hope so.
Mhm.
Talk about your parents. You decided to tell them the truth when they wanted to invite Dan to a family sister's wedding or a family event. If I
Yes, and my sister's with us here on this call, and actually, I'm sure she didn't know about that when I showed her the manuscript before it was published. And he had this predator had ingratiated himself into my parents' lives, and they considered him a good friend. Again, this is not uncommon. Of course, this happens in the Catholic Church almost as a matter of course, because priests are come on such a pedestal and are welcomed into the home, and many priests have sort of a built-in relationship with parishioners and the families, right? But this happens in Jewish communities too, with leaders in the community. And that's what happened. And my parents considered him a very good friend. They, as a matter of course, invited him to my sister's wedding. And this was after I had realized I had begun coming to terms with my trauma, but before I was really deep into therapy or being ready to confront him. And I just had a complete freak out. And because I realized there was no way that I could have him there at this family event. And I called him up and told him not to come. And he said he would find it, he'd make up an excuse not to be there. I had confronted him in the summer of 1978. So in some ways, he knew that his cover was blown with me and that I was potentially a loose cannon. So interestingly, and this is not in the book, after that phone conversation about my sister's wedding and him not coming, he sent me a letter, which I still have, which basically confessed to what he had done. And this is a social worker with amazing, and con artist, more to the point, with incredible skills of manipulation. And in this letter, he went right for the, oh, woe is me, I'm so pained by what I did to you, and I can't possibly imagine how much I hurt you, and I'll never, that's never happened again, I'll never do that to anyone else, and sort of playing this whole card of trying to put me off anything I might do, right, to bring him to justice by saying that he's paying the price for this horrific thing he did to me. It would take me another 3 years to be emotionally prepared, to go to law enforcement. And by that point, he was at yet another camp, this one in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. It took a long time to really gird myself to do that.
Boy, oh boy. Go back to your parents a little. When you told them what was going on, you wanted to, I mean, you said it in the book, but you want to talk about their reaction and how you want to forgive them right away?
That was a really heart-wrenching conversation, because I knew, I wrestled a long time with whether to tell them at all. I didn't want to, it's just transmitting this pain. I mean, I knew that in telling them, this is something they'll be in shock. They're going to have to work through this and carry this till the day they die. It's just a terrible thing to have to share with your parents. And at the same time, I understood, and my wife really understood and urged me to do it, that I could never have a healthy relationship with them until I did it, because I had so much buried resentment and even anger at them for not having protected me from this guy. And here he was still in their life, right? So we were all living this lie. So it they were in shock, although my mother almost immediately said I had my suspicions, which, I think is really telling, because a lot of when an adult spends so much one-on-one time with a child, which today we'd see as a total red flag, it's an unusual parent who it doesn't have at least a flicker of a thought that, is there something weird going on here? And that's the moment that I encourage people today when I'm talking to people in institutions or to parents or to people who are on camps. You have to pay attention, and honor those thoughts, because we push them away instinctively. Oh, no, 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 no. Like my mother did. That's too crazy. How could I even think that? And, I think from my mother's point of view, I don't want to say point of view, but emotionally, a sort of dam broke for her, and she put the pieces together and why our relationship had unraveled since I was 13. And she sort of wanted to instantly put it back together without looking at what had happened. It was just too painful for her. I was basically, she wanted forgiveness, and I was incapable of forgiving her. I wish I was. I wish I could say, boom, I forgive you, but that's not what the reality was, and really what I was asking them was to, as I was doing, walk back through that process and just share with me what they had been thinking and feeling and how they had become ensnared by this guy. And they couldn't do that with me. It was just too much for them. And so I kept them at arm's length for several more years, although I think the telling point, and you see it almost right away in the book, is my mother was a great aid to me in the law enforcement process. So in other words, she would help me with ideas and contacts, and we sort of developed this working partnership of trying to bring this guy to justice. And that was our way of connecting, even though our relationship was very, very, very challenged. She wanted much more than I could give at that point. And it took a long, long time.
Do you think she was a victim also of him?
Of him? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. He was a con artist of the first order. And he conned her. He conned dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds, we don't know how many, of parents. I can tell you for a fact that some of them were social workers, some of them were his colleagues. It was almost his MO to go after families that he knew. And it didn't matter how close they were to him or where they stood in the constellation of the United Jewish Appeal or the YMHA, or in Chicago, the Young Men's Jewish Council, or in Pittsburgh, the JCC of Pittsburgh. He would go right after kids of people in power. And that's how brazen and fearless and adept he was at manipulating people. And, this is a huge lesson, because that is not unusual. Most of us still want to believe that, child sex predators are, strangers off the street. And in fact, the ones that do the greatest damage across institutions are highly respected, charismatic, successful professionals in the community. And most people have absolutely no clue what their personal private compulsions are. And of course, that gives them the camouflage to act out what they're going to act out.
Terrible. It's awful. So going back to camp again, David, your cousin,
Mhm.
he was like a really nice guy, and he tried to
Yeah.
approach you and get you to talk and to discuss what happened. I guess he sort of knew, right? I mean, he saw what was going on.
You
And
know, I don't think David, he didn't know. And he said he didn't know, but he just knew something was seriously weird. And, you know, he and I were very close. I mean, from the time we were born, but especially after my father died, I spent a ton of time in his house, and his parents were really my surrogate parents. And so, you know, that particularly that last summer at camp when we were 15, we went to camp still very bonded. And by the time the summer ended, Dan Farinella, the abuser, had completely destroyed our relationship quite intentionally. I mean, again, this is the very common among abusers, is to part of isolating the kid, right, is to blow up relationships with other people. And he was very, very good at that. And so David, to his credit, really, it's interesting you pick up on that, because some people have said to me, my God, he was the only one who saw through this guy. He knew there was something rotten. He didn't know exactly what it was. Although there's one scene, of course, in the book during that last summer when we were 15, that he actually walked into Farinella's bedroom right after he sexually abused me. And I was in the bed, and David knew something's wrong, and told his parents,
right.
who tried to talk to my mother, who wouldn't hear of it. So, you know, we get very locked into our, particularly when it comes to people we've put up on a pedestal, and our, you know, leaders in the community, very locked into our beliefs, and it's tough to change them. And that's the piece of it that's as true today as it was 50 years ago. You know, protocols in youth groups and camps have greatly improved, and prevention measures have greatly improved. But what stayed the same is human nature. It's no easier for a person to say out loud, I think the director of this institution, whom all of you think is God's gift to our community, is sexually assaulting children. That's no easier today than it was 50 years ago. And that's why it remains incredibly challenging. That's why even when you have, I'm just going to cite one of many recent examples, Camp Ramah in the Berkshires. Camp Ramah, some of you, I'm sure, have heard of, you know, sort of the flagship camping, overnight camping camps of the conservative Jewish movement. They put child protection measures in place several years ago, and have really headlined them as, you know, the best, the strongest, the toughest. A girl filed suit a couple of months ago, alleging that she was sexually assaulted at Camp Ramah in the Berkshires 2 summers ago, went to the director of the camp the very next day. What was his response? Did he follow the protocols? No. He refused to let her call home. He refused to contact law enforcement. He refused to let her talk to anyone else, and he let the sexual assailant stay in camp. So what does this tell you about human nature, right? You can have the best protocols in the world, but if you haven't changed the culture of an institution, then they're worthless. And you can change the culture. It just takes a lot more work than people think it does. You know, it's easy to say, oh, well, we're just going to put some protections in place and pin them on the wall and point to them when we hire new people. That is not going to do it. You have to train employees over and over and over. You have to convince them that child safety is the absolute top job of the organization. And there's no second and third priority. That is it. And you have to convince them they're going to be rewarded, not punished, if they come forward with allegations. And these are not easy things to do. Some institutions are doing this, and people who send their kids to camp there are going to be much safer.
I hope so. It's really scary. I mean, I know we all send our kids to summer camp and our grandkids. It's scary. I mean,
It is scary. I mean, talk to anyone in the business. We've got Catherine Robb actually on this event, who's I just want to mention her because she's the director of Child USA Advocacy, which is the leading national advocate for child protection laws and reforming statutes of limitations, so people like me can bring suit decades later, to hold institutions accountable. And I'm sure she would tell you, these, as will other experts, summer camps pose particular risks for obvious reasons. You have kids away from home for a prolonged period of time. So you have other adults in this role of en loco parentis, the Latin for, the surrogate parent. They're responsible. And that is a tall order, to keep kids safe. That said, obviously, the vast majority of kids go away to summer camp and have a spectacular time and remember it for the rest of their life as a formative and fantastic experience. But there is a consistent, steady percentage of children who will be devastated for a lifetime by what happens to them at summer camp. And that's what we have to confront.
right. Boy, I'm sorry this happened to you. So you went to the police and Dan was never prosecuted.
Yeah.
Why was this all swept under the rug after you went to the police? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was really that was a lesson and wake-up call in the systemic failures, not just of youth organizations, but law enforcement. I mean, in some ways, the way the FBI acted was a foreshadowing of what you saw in the gymnast case 2 years ago, or was it just last year? I can't remember, where the FBI knew of Larry Nassar's abuse for at least 18 months and sat on it. And so you got to ask yourself, if the FBI isn't willing to protect the most beloved girls in America, why the hell are they going to care about someone like me? I was a nobody. I just don't think it was a priority. And sadly, if you look at the history of the Bureau and certain local law enforcement agencies, it's the same story over and over again. Now, that has improved, but back then, it was not unusual for that scenario where an organization is looking to, as soon as the JCC of Pittsburgh found out they had a sex predator on their hand. Now, I wasn't in the room when the FBI and the Pittsburgh DA sat down with them, but my understanding direct from the Pittsburgh DA was, all right, we're going to get rid of this guy. They didn't question it. I mean, I had collected statements from victims and witnesses in multiple states. So it's understandable that it's not moral, but understandable that the organization wants to try to get rid of the guy quietly because they avoid a PR nightmare. It's not understandable that law enforcement lets them do that. That's their job, is to make them face the music, to investigate and to prosecute. In this case, the Pittsburgh Police Department very much wanted to investigate and prosecute, and the DA overruled them. Why he did that remains a mystery. My guess is that for him, it was out of sight, out of mind. We'll get this guy out of here and problem solve for now, and we'll move on to the next case. And the second piece of that was my case and the case of other victims that I had brought to the to the Allegheny County DA and the FBI were past the statutes of limitations, which, by the way, is why statutes are so important in child sex abuse cases. The average age of disclosure is 52 years old. That's how long it takes a victim of child sex abuse to come forward. Our cases had expired years and years earlier, our cases in Connecticut and New York. So the DA and the FBI in Pittsburgh were going to have to investigate the camp that the Pittsburgh JCC was running. They were going to have to find fresh cases. I actually gave them leads to finding kids. I'd been given tips by people in the camp. But at the end of the day, I think they were too lazy. I think it was easier to just let it, here we have an organization willing to get rid of this guy and we're just going to move on. I will tell you, I'm in the process of talking to an investigative reporter because I'm as curious as everyone else to get my hands on the files of the DA and the FBI. And in fact, there's a former FBI special agent, Jim Clemente, who some of you may know from because he's the producer and writer of Criminal Minds, which is the longest running true crime series on TV. He and I talked about this at length on his podcast. If you can go to my website, stephenmillsauthor.com, and there's a link to the podcast with Jim, and it's fascinating because he approaches it. By the way, he's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. Same time period, grew up in New York, was abused in a Catholic summer camp, became an FBI agent, and he is just horrified at what the FBI did in my case and wants to get to the bottom of it and has offered to help. So, I'm hopeful we're going to get some answers, but until then, it's kind of, this was business as usual back then. And I am sad to say, based on the way the FBI operated in the Larry Nassar case, it probably continues to be business as usual in too many cases.
Hold on. Sorry.
Gesundheit.
So, I'm sorry. I Googled Dan Farelli and I couldn't find him.
Mm-hmm.
His name didn't come up, and I thought that was so interesting. The only thing that came up was your book.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I don't know if that was intentional, Carol, or not. In other words, if his family or others have made attempts to, kind of erase things, but I don't think so. Going back to, of course, I've been thinking about this, as we talked about at the outset. I've been thinking about writing about this for decades. And so as soon as the internet was a thing, I was looking for, his presence online. I mean, he died in 93, so it wasn't going to be him, but it could be people talking about him, right? And this is so telling. There were, I haven't seen them lately. They may have been taken down since my book. There were several testimonials to him from former campers when he died that all that were of a pattern. Dan was like a father to me. After my own father died, he really helped me get through that. I was 12 or 13 at the time. And right, this is a pattern of testimonials. Well, this is just classic male sexual abuse victim, right? Of someone who hasn't even realized that they were abused by this person. And I wrote down their emails. I sent them information about the book when it came out. I hope I hear from them. But again, this is very, you saw this in the gymnast case. And this can be something hard for people to grasp. How can you not know you were sexually abused? there was a terrific piece in the newspaper when Rachel Den Hollander came forward by two sisters who were gymnasts, saying that their first reaction when they read Rachel Den Hollander's story was, thank God that didn't happen to us. And their second reaction was, oh my God, he did that to us. That's how powerful their denial was around it. And until someone names it, it's very often difficult to put the pieces together.
It's really amazing what you've been through. It's unbelievable. What are you most proud of today that what you have done? I mean, you have to applaud yourself for getting this far.
You know, I feel good about advocating right now. You know, working with people like Catherine Robb and Marcy Hamilton at Child USA, with Darkness to Light, with 1 in 6 and Male Survivor, which are the, you know, men's survivor networks, and really trying to raise public awareness and make it safer for kids. I really, to me, the bottom line is, are kids going to be safer at camp this summer? That's what I'm focused on. And I'm of the belief that you need to confront these historic cases and learn the lessons in order to make kids safer now. And this is not, and by the way, most of the Jewish organizations that I name in the book apparently don't agree with me on this, because and I want to mention this just because I think it really goes to the crux of what we're up against in changing the culture. Since my book was published, I mean, I was naive enough to think that, oh, well, these organizations, I mean, we're talking about the creme de la creme in the Jewish world, right? UJA Federation, the JCC, several YMHAs who employed Dan Farinella over 30 years. And their response has been not just crickets, but everything possible to muzzle me. The JCC of Pittsburgh has banned me from their camp alumni Facebook page, where people want to hear what happened at the camp. The UJA has filed a motion to dismiss my suit under the Child Victims Act on the grounds that most of the abuse happened in Connecticut, therefore they're not responsible under the New York law. Well, this is a defense that several organizations have used, some of them successfully, but it blows my mind for the UJA to do it, because they know perfectly well that Dan Farinella's MO was transporting kids like me across state lines to sexually assault us. And here they are 50 years later, piggybacking on that scheme to try to evade accountability, you know? So this is what happens in organizations where you prioritize reducing legal liability instead of protecting children. And it's a real problem. And it's, again, this has less to do with my case, right? I mean, that's history. I'm bringing this case under the Child Victims Act because of what's going on right now. And my contention is that the UJA and the JCC of Pittsburgh, if they are unable and unwilling to look at what happened 40, 50 years ago, they haven't changed the culture, and they're not going to be protecting kids this summer.
Well, keep doing what you're doing, and we need people like you.
Thank you, Carol.
Are you writing another book? I mean, you said you're a writer.
I've got ideas, but at the moment, I've got my hands full with the things we were just talking about. So
yeah, I'm sure you do. I'm sort of done with my questions. This was so interesting and eye-opening, as was your book. I don't see anything. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Dan? You can unmute yourself and talk if you want.
It's not really a question, but I have to admit that I took the book home. I read the title And then I said, I'm not sure what I want to read this book. I was an abused child. It was my father. And he never paid for it. But what you said about the abuser convincing the child that you're the only one, that you're very special. And I didn't find out that he had abused my daughter. And she told me years and years later. And at that point, he was out of my life. So just.
Carol? Carol, can you hear me? Carol? Carol?
Yes, we hear you. I don't know who's talking. He's muted. Stephen, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, somehow I got muted. That is awful. I'm so
Hello?
Yeah,
sorry
someone's
to hear
talking.
that.
Oh, hi. I just want to say one thing, basically. Whenever you're an employer, you have to read these today. You always have to read anything about sexual harassment and sign it. They take you into the office, the employers, like I work for Marshalls, and they take you into the office and you have to sign that you're not going to be doing that to any of the employees or customers or anything like that. So today is a lot different. You have to sign that you're not going to be an abuser or sexually abuse or harass.
So I'm just gonna thank you for that comment. I'm just gonna hold it for 1 second and finish responding to the first person, because I think that's crucially important, this issue of abuse within a family and especially intergenerational abuse, which is way more prevalent than is discussed. In fact, there's a new organization called Complicated Courage, which is about exactly this topic. And it's just really, really important for these stories to come out, because there's just a whole nother layer of secrecy and shame and pain, that comes with abuse within families. So I really thank you for sharing that and honor that. And what a horrific thing to have to go through. So in terms of what employees have to sign, yes, again, here's where we get to sort of exactly what I was talking about before, the difference between what's on paper and do organizations change the culture. Almost everywhere now, you have to sign waivers and commitments, whether it's, at every level of employee. And I can guarantee you that every sexual predator and every youth serving organization has, signed exactly those papers, swearing up and down that they will never touch a child or sexually harass an adult. And every person may have signed a commitment to report harassment or abuse. So the question then becomes, are people keeping their commitments that they've made in writing? Well, we know for sure that the assailants aren't, because these assaults and abuse happen, right? So this goes back to the issue I was talking about before. Is the institution, whether it's corporate or nonprofit, are they doing enough employee training to really inculcate a sense of, if you see something, say something, and really encourage people that this is a top priority to reduce sexual assault.
Definitely. And sometimes they should make pop-up visits to the camp or wherever it is, sleepaway camp or something like that. They should make pop-up visits, to check on things. Not just loud things. They should have pop-up visits. Hey, I'm going to check up on your code today or something like that, and not, people aren't expecting it. So if they make a pop-up visit, this way they can check. And people should feel free to discuss it, even though it's something that they don't want to discuss.
That's right.
But it's very personal.
Yeah.
Thanks, Trudy. Linda has her hand up, Stephen. Linda Lopez, go ahead.
Hey, Linda.
Hi, Stephen. So I've had the experience now of a couple of people, in fact, we know them, who got your book
Mhm,
and then didn't read it because
Mhm.
they said, "Oh my, like I just
Yeah.
don't think I want to read it." And I was very encouraging, and both of them afterwards thanked me, for encouraging them because it is a great book. But I
Mhm.
was wondering what you would say to people who,
Yeah.
yeah,
I would say two things. If you're like our first commenter, if you were the victim of abuse, um, tread carefully. Know that it's tough to read a book like this if you were abused as a child and not feel triggered. So take your time, or don't read it. I mean, it's I'm in a men's group with a lot of male survivors, some of whom have read it and some of whom just can't bring themselves to do it. So if you're a survivor, that's a whole separate category. And we all have an inner wisdom, I really believe, that lets us know when we're ready to read about, to read these stories. And for everyone else, all I can tell you is the feedback that I've gotten. I mean, uniformly, that the book is a page turner, and it's sort of a misnomer to call it a book about sexual abuse. It's really much, much bigger than that. It's a family saga. It's a Jewish family saga. It's a book about my father, our relationship, the arc of father-son thing over generations. It's a book about relationship and marriage and therapy and the human condition. And so I wouldn't pigeonhole it, and I think I know most people who have read it don't pigeonhole it as that. And I'd be a rich man now if I had $1 for every person who emailed me saying, I read your book in 24 hours. So to me, that says it's a great read, and that makes me happy, because honestly, when I set out to write it in 2018, I very deliberately said, okay, this is a tough topic. No one really wants to read about this. So you're going to have to do it in a way that draws the reader in and doesn't let them go. And so that was my aim, so I'm really gratified that people who do read it have that response.
absolutely. You accomplished it, Stephen.
Thank you, Linda.
Well, Marcia, go ahead. You have your hand up. You have to unmute, Marcia.
Hi, first of all, Carol and Stephen, thank you for a wonderful, enlightening, interesting discussion. And your intelligence shines through, Stephen, in this whole
Thank you.
discussion. I wanted to ask you, if your parents had sat you down when they started to notice that you were changing around the age of 13 or so, they had some suspicion. Do you think you could have told them what was going on, or do you think you still would have shielded yourself from it?
I think the answer is no, sadly,
And don't do that.
because of how terrified I was of this man. And actually, those of you who read the book, you'll know my fears at age 13 was that I had no clue. I didn't know what sexual abuse was, right? I didn't have a label for that. So without any language or framework, I thought that he was holding me hostage because he had some larger plan, which I was always trying to figure out what it was. Why would he do this? Why would he do this? He was married with a kid. Never occurred to me till I was 15, 2 years later, that he got sexual gratification from what he did. It had to be something else, right? I thought he had some master plan. And I was convinced that if I divulged anything, he was going to kill my parents and me. That's what I believed. So no, I don't think I would have. But the bigger question really is, and this is a question I talk to children's advocacy centers about all the time with forensic investigators and interviewers. So these are people who have to interview kids who they suspect of being abused, and to law enforcement people. How do you talk to a kid who's been abused who does not want to share that? Right? That is so in my book, toward the end, an FBI agent says to me, boys who have been abused are tougher to crack than murderers. You know, you try all the tricks and they don't break. And that was me. It was nothing that was going to break me. And I've spent a lot of time the last year and talking to people in this profession. How do you get boys especially to talk? Girls too, but of course I'm much more familiar with the boy side of the equation. And I think it has to do with, it's got to take place over time, and you have to build trust with an authority figure who can deprogram you, really. It's kind of like cult deprogramming. You have to
In
come to
your-
trust someone who can explain to you, this is actually what happened. And he does this to other kids, and you didn't do anything wrong. And we're going to help you escape this nightmare.
In your answer to me, you mentioned that you thought he might kill your parents. Was that ever voiced to you? And have you heard that threat made to other people who are
No,
like you?
it wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. It was implicit. This was, so this is something really fascinating, because I'm going to share something I just found out this week about him. So if you read the book, you know that Dan Farinella, his father, according to him, according to Dan, was in the mob. He told me that when I was 13. And Farinella's whole thing was, you know, he grew up in the Bronx. He had this kind of street tough demeanor that was hugely appealing to kids, you know, street smart, totally unlike the other social workers, you know, who had a much harder time talking to kids and reaching kids. He just had this talk straight, no bullshit thing with kids and spoke their language because he came from the streets. Because he told me that his father worked for the mob, when I was trying to figure out in my 13-year-old mind, why the hell is this guy kidnapping me? I thought maybe he works for the mob. And that's all I needed to fantasize, right? To think that he was out to kill me. He never said anything. He didn't have to. I was terrified. This week, someone from his family, 2 generations removed, called me and told me that Dan Farinella was a bag man for the mob in the Bronx in the 1940s. And he knew this, they knew this from their grandfather, who was Farinella's brother-in-law. So I was smarter than I thought at 13,
Yeah,
right? You couldn't make this up.
no. Boy, oh boy. Anita has a question for you. Raise hand.
Yes, a question and then a comment. I've been trying to get your book in large print. I went through Nassau Library. There is no such thing. Are
Mm.
they going to make a large print edition?
You know, not that I'm aware of. Do you ever listen to books on tape?
I fall asleep when I do that.
Oh, sorry. Drink
Can
more
I
coffee.
answer that question, Stephen? Can I
Yeah.
answer that?
Please.
So if you get the book on Overdrive, you can enlarge the print to make it large print. If you
Yes, but
download the book, if you
I
download,
understand, but I find it very difficult to read a book on my iPad. I
right.
lose the pages. I want to go
Mhm.
back and it becomes very unwieldy. I like to hold a book in my hand.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, I'm waiting for it to be in large print.
All right. Well, I will send my publisher an email.
Okay. My other comment is, I don't think that any of these organizations would take the responsibility, because that would be extremely bad for business. What family is going to send their kid to a camp where they allow this to happen? I think for business reasons, they're never going to admit it.
Well, I think that's what their lawyers tell them. I disagree. And I disagree because I actually think the opposite. Because until you confront it, episodes of sexual abuse will continue to happen. And there's a drip, drip, drip until the whole thing blows up in a current case, as, for example, is happening now at Camp Ramah. The challenge for the organizations is to confront it head on and say, we know this happens at all camps and all youth serving organizations, but we've got the courage to deal with it and put the best possible protections in place. Those are the, because then you've got a camp that has not only committed to it, but is walking the talk. And as a parent, that's the camp I'm going to trust, because clearly they've come to grips with the reality of this and are putting actual enforceable measures in place, as opposed to those who continue to sweep it under the rug or pretend it doesn't exist. I can tell you for sure that the places, because we see this over and over again, people, advocates who I know who offer to work with, to do trainings, child sex abuse trainings with schools or camps or, after school programs, are turned away. And then a year later, they'll get a call, we need you to come in tomorrow. Well, you know what happened? A kid was sexually abused, and they suddenly realized that they actually do have to have enforceable measures in place. They do have to train their employees. And so you're so much better off as an organization getting ahead of the curve than being at the mercy of someone abusing kids, because then you're completely at the whim of a child predator. And that the sad thing is, in these situations, that the interests of organizations become aligned with the interest of the sexual abuser, because neither of them wants the truth to get out. And eventually the truth will out. I mean, particularly today, the truth is going to out, because victims have many more outlets and support. And so you're much better off being ahead of this than behind it.
Stephen, there were a couple of comments in the chat room. So Catherine Robb said 40% of child sexual abuse happens within the family. Lydia Wen wrote, I want to thank you for having the strength to tell your story. I know somebody who was abused nearly 5 decades ago, and still the trauma still reverberates today. Catherine Robb wrote again, employees require NDAs, non-disparaging clauses, to be within those contracts. Marlene wrote, you did a great job. Thank you, Marlene. She said I did a great job.
Can you unmute Catherine just to talk about those 2 points a little bit?
Yeah,
I mean,
hold on.
Because she's expert in both of those.
Okay.
Hi there.
Catherine, do you think we hear less about child sex abuse within
Institutions. Families or institutions?
Right.
I think right now the best data is somewhere between 36 and 42-ish% of all child sexual abuse happens within the family. And another really important piece of data, and I know, Stephen, you know this already, is that 91% of the perpetrators in children's lives are someone the child knows very, very well. Stranger danger is a misnomer. It's just something that doesn't happen. It's very, very rare. If I could just touch on what Stephen was just talking about in terms of institutions, really what's going to make institutions do the right thing, as opposed to saying, oh, we can't let this out because we're going to lose business, as one of the attendees was saying. Really what we need to do is we need to hold institutions accountable. And when we hold those institutions accountable, then they do the right thing. But no institution, you can look through the history of time, pretty much all the time, institutions don't do anything until they have a judgment hanging over their head that they've been sued. And really, that's why we work at Child US Advocacy, to change these laws to allow victims to come forward. As Stephen said, the average age is about 52. And sadly, most of those statute of limitations have closed the doors to the courthouse. So really what we need to do is hold institutions accountable, and also bring in insurance companies. If we can get insurance companies on the right side of this, to say, look, if you don't have better policies, practices, procedures, responses in relation to the safety of children, you're not going to get insurance. And what institution survives without insurance? They just can't survive. So I'm grateful for Stephen's work, and his book, as so many people have said, is magnificent and it's wonderful. And please, Stephen, you need to get it in larger print so everyone can enjoy it.
Okay, that's my
Right.
new top priority. And I did, thanks for that, Catherine. And it reminds me, I wanted to just close the loop on what I was saying before about my case under the Child Victims Act, because I think it's telling. The UJA Federation filed this motion to dismiss the case based on, the abuse happening in Connecticut. And just 2 weeks ago, an appellate court in New York threw out that defense. Not in my case, a different case of a boy's family about a camp in Massachusetts. So the higher court has now clearly said it does not matter where in the US abuse occurs. The only thing that matters under the Child Victims Act in New York is that the child was living in New York. So, that is really, I think, a tremendous victory for getting accountability. Or at least will let my case proceed. And I think it's tremendously important for the reason Catherine said. It's very tough to get organizations focused on this issue without having accountability on past cases and having judgments hanging over them.
Stephen, thank you. This was really so interesting. I appreciate it. Not only was your book fabulous, but you're a terrific speaker. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thank you all for attending. And thanks to friends Norman and Cheryl for connecting us.
Yeah, it was a good book they gave me.
You're making a difference, Stephen.
God
Yeah.
bless. Thank you.
Thank
Good to
you.
hear.